15 years ago, beneath falling cherry blossoms, two hearts made a vow. Now Seoul's most ruthless corporate lawyer finds himself defending the small flower shop of the woman he left behind, forcing him to choose between the promise he broke and the power he gained. Can love bloom twice in the same place? Or do some petals scatter forever? Some promises weigh heavier with time, like cherry blossoms caught in spring rain. Park Ji-hoon knew this better than most, as he stood before the small flower shop, its faded sign reading, "Blooming Memories," catching the late afternoon light. 15 years ago, under these same cherry trees that lined the street, he had made a promise to Song Min-ah. They were just high school students then, she with her dream of owning a flower shop, he with his secret burden of family debt. Together, they'd woven flower crowns and sworn to meet again when the blossoms fell. Now, at 34, Ji-hoon adjusted his expensive suit and gripped the legal notice in his hand. The irony wasn't lost on him. Seoul's most feared corporate lawyer, tasked with delivering an eviction notice to the very spot where he'd once promised forever to a girl with starlight in her eyes. Through the shop window he could see her. Min-ah hadn't changed much. Her hair was shorter now, but she still moved with that same gentle grace as she arranged roses in a crystal vase. A customer smiled at something she said, and Ji-hoon felt his chest tighten at the sound of her laugh floating through the glass. He hadn't meant to find her like this. The development project file had been just another case on his desk until he saw her name. Song Min-ah, owner of Blooming Memories, scheduled for demolition to make way for a luxury shopping complex. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. Taking a deep breath, Ji-hoon pushed open the door. The bell chimed softly, and the sweet scent of flowers wrapped around him like a memory. Min-ah looked up, her professional smile freezing as recognition dawned in her eyes. "Welcome to Blooming Memories," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "How can I help you today?" Ji-hoon's carefully prepared speech vanished. Behind her, on a shelf nearly hidden by potted orchids, sat a framed photo he remembered too well. Two teenagers with flower crowns, their smiles untouched by time. Ji-hoon cleared his throat, forcing himself to look away from the photograph. "Ms. Song, I'm here representing Park & Associates Legal Group." He extended the envelope, his fingers stiff around the crisp paper. The professional mask he'd perfected over 15 years felt suddenly too tight, like a suit he'd outgrown. Min-ah took the envelope, her fingertips brushing against his for a fraction of a second. She paused, her eyes catching the thin white scar near his temple, a reminder of the day he'd fallen while picking cherries from her grandmother's tree. Recognition flickered across her face like a candle in wind. "Ji-hoon?" Her voice was barely a whisper. The envelope trembled in her hands, unopened. The small shop seemed to shrink around them, heavy with unspoken words. Bunches of fresh daisies and lilies watched from their crystal vases, their sweet perfume making the air thick with memory. Through the window, cherry blossom petals danced on the spring breeze, mocking the gravity of the moment. "The development company is offering fair compensation," Ji-hoon said, his words mechanical and rehearsed. He gestured to the notice, refusing to acknowledge the way Min-ah's eyes hadn't left his face. "The entire block is scheduled for—" "This was my grandmother's life savings," Min-ah interrupted, her quiet voice carrying more weight than his legal jargon. She moved to a vintage frame on the wall, where pressed cherry blossoms lay preserved behind glass. "She believed in our spring promise enough to help me build this place." Ji-hoon's carefully constructed walls cracked at those two words. Spring promise. He remembered that day with painful clarity. The taste of cherry candy, the weight of Min-ah's head on his shoulder, and the vow they'd made to create something beautiful together. "The development plans are already approved," he said. But his eyes betrayed him, drifting to where elderly ladies gathered around a work table, arranging spring flowers with arthritic but determined hands. Min-ah taught community classes here every Wednesday. This information wasn't in his case files, but he'd known it somehow, had perhaps always known she'd build more than just a shop. "You said this place would always be our secret garden," Min-ah said softly, absently touching the faded friendship bracelet on her wrist, the one he'd given her the day of their promise. "Remember? Under the cherry trees?" Ji-hoon's phone buzzed with an urgent message. The development company wanted to fast-track the demolition, taking advantage of pre-existing permits. They planned to break ground during cherry blossom season, of all times. As he turned to leave, his briefcase knocked against an old filing cabinet. A pressed cherry blossom floated out from between its pages, landing at his feet like a question he couldn't answer. He left it there, next to the potted orchids that had always been Minna's favorites, and walked out into the falling petals with the weight of 2 promises around his neck. The one he'd made as a boy under cherry trees, and the one he'd made as a man in corporate boardrooms. Back in his Tesla, Ji-hun loosened his tie and pressed his forehead against the cool leather steering wheel. The scent of Minna's flower shop, roses, lilies, and 15 years of memories, clung to his suit. He pulled out his phone, staring at the message from the development company. Expedite demolition timeline. Begin next week. His fingers hovered over the keypad, but instead of responding, he found himself scrolling through old photos buried deep in his phone. There it was, a teenage Minna arranging daisies in her grandmother's shop, her hair tied back with a pink ribbon he'd given her for her 16th birthday. He remembered taking that picture, remembered how she'd laughed and told him to delete it. A knock on his window startled him. Mrs. Kim, the elderly owner of the tea shop next door, peered in with knowing eyes. Ji-hun rolled down the window, his professional mask slipping back into place. "Young man," she said, holding out a small paper bag. "Your favorite, red bean buns, still warm." Her wrinkled face creased with a smile. "You used to buy these every Friday after helping Minna with deliveries." Ji-hun accepted the bag, the warmth seeping through his cold fingers. "Mrs. Kim, you should know. The development plans." "Ah, we all know about those fancy plans." She waved her hand dismissively. "But tell me, Ji-hun, does that big company know about the community garden Minna started for the children? Or how she delivers free flowers to the hospital every week?" She patted his hand. "Some promises are worth more than money, aren't they?" Inside the shop, Minna discovered the fallen cherry blossom by the filing cabinet. Her hands trembled as she opened the old cabinet drawer, pulling out a dusty envelope she'd sealed 15 years ago. Inside, a pressed cherry blossom petal held careful handwriting. "I promise to protect our garden forever. Ji-hun." She placed the new fallen petal beside its aged twin, noticing how they matched perfectly, like 2 halves of a broken heart. Through the window, she watched Ji-hun talking with Mrs. Kim, saw how his corporate armor cracked just slightly as he accepted the red bean buns, his childhood favorite. Her phone buzzed with messages from the neighborhood committee. They'd gathered over 50 signatures against the development. But it wasn't the signatures that made her pause. It was the photos they'd attached. Old pictures of the shop, of children learning to arrange flowers, of elderly residents finding purpose in their weekly flower classes. And there, in the background of one faded photo, was teenage Ji-hun, carefully hanging fairy lights for their first Christmas display. Minna touched the friendship bracelet on her wrist, its threads worn but holding strong. Outside, cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent, each petal a reminder of promises made and broken, of dreams scattered and gathered, of love buried but never quite forgotten. The evening shadows lengthened across the street as Ji-hun finally started his car, the paper bag of red bean buns still warm in his passenger seat. As he drove through the familiar streets, his phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from the development company, each one more urgent than the last. But his mind kept drifting to the archived documents he'd discovered earlier that day. Blueprints from 15 years ago bearing his father's signature, marking the exact spot where his family's bookstore had once stood. In his downtown office the next morning, Ji-hun spread out the yellowed papers across his desk. The similarity was uncanny. The old development plan mirrored the current one almost exactly. His fingers traced the faded lines, remembering how his father had stood in this same position, making the same impossible choice between family legacy and corporate survival. "Mr. Park," his assistant interrupted. "The community meeting starts in an hour." At the community center, Minna arranged chairs with trembling hands. She'd spent the morning practicing her presentation, but seeing Ji-hun walk in, impeccable in his charcoal suit, made her nearly drop the petition papers. Their eyes met briefly before he took his seat in the back row, and for a moment, She saw the boy who used to help her carry flower deliveries after school. "The Cherry Blossom District isn't just buildings," Minna began, her voice growing stronger as she clicked through photographs on the projector. "It's Mrs. Kim's tea shop, where students still study for exams. It's Mr. Lee's hardware store, where 3 generations have learned to fix broken things instead of throwing them away." She paused on a photo of her flower shop. "It's where children learn that beauty can grow even in concrete corners." Ji-hoon watched her from the shadows, his legal pad blank before him. Each word she spoke echoed with memories. Summer evenings stringing lights between the shops. Winter mornings shoveling snow from elderly neighbors' doorsteps. When she showed the photograph of the community garden, he recognized his own teenage handwriting on the small wooden sign. "Every flower deserves a chance to bloom." The meeting ended with tensions high, but as people filed out, Ji-hoon noticed something fall from Minna's folder. He reached for it at the same moment she did, their fingers brushing against the fallen cherry blossom petal. The touch sent electricity through both of them, freezing them in place as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the community center windows. Neither spoke, but in that moment of suspended silence, the weight of their shared past hung between them like the ghost of cherry blossoms on a spring breeze. Minna pulled back first, clutching the petal to her chest, while Ji-hoon's hand remained suspended in the air, reaching for something that had slipped away 15 years ago. Ji-hoon withdrew his hand slowly, the phantom warmth of Minna's touch lingering on his fingertips. He watched her hurry away, her floral print dress disappearing through the community center doors. With heavy steps, he made his way back to his mother's house, where he'd promised to help sort through old boxes in the attic. "Ginny, look what I found," his mother called out, using his childhood nickname as she pulled a dusty photo album from beneath stacked moving boxes. Ji-hoon's throat tightened at the sight of their high school graduation photos spread across its pages. There he was, younger and smiling, his arm draped casually around Minna's shoulders. Cherry blossoms dotted their black graduation robes like snow. "You two were inseparable," his mother said softly, running her finger along the edge of a photo where they stood beneath the old cherry tree, their hands clasped as they made that fateful promise. "I kept everything, you know. Even the dried flowers she used to bring from her parents' shop." Ji-hoon's fingers trembled as he turned the page, finding pressed cherry blossoms. Their pink petals faded to a gentle brown. Behind them, tucked in the album's pocket, was an envelope with his name written in Minna's neat teenage handwriting. The seal remained unbroken, the letter inside undisturbed for 15 years. Before he could process the discovery, his phone buzzed. The development company was calling an emergency meeting with local business owners. When he arrived at the conference room downtown, Minna was already there, standing at the front with other shop owners. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she argued against the demolition plans. "These cherry trees have stood here for 50 years, she said, her voice steady, despite the tension in her shoulders. "They're not just trees. They're the heart of our community. Mr. Park knows this better than anyone." Her eyes met his, challenging him to deny their shared history. Other shop owners nodded in recognition. "Your father's bookstore was right there, wasn't it, Ji-hoon?" Mrs. Kim from the tea shop asked. "Next to where Minna's flower shop is now. You used to help her carry water buckets for the sidewalk plants every morning before school." The weight of their words pressed against his chest as he stood to present the development plans. The familiar faces looking back at him weren't just community members anymore. They were keepers of his memories, witnesses to promises he'd made and broken. As he clicked through the slideshow of modern buildings and parking structures, he couldn't help but notice how they would cast shadows over the spot where he and Min-ah had first held hands, where spring had once meant more than just another season passing. The unopened letter burned in his briefcase like a secret waiting to break free, while outside, the cherry trees that had witnessed their promise swayed in the autumn wind, their branches already preparing for another spring they might not live to see. Ji-hoon stared at his briefcase, knowing the unopened letter waited inside like a time capsule of lost promises. The development company's meeting had ended, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the now empty conference room. Through the wide windows, he could see Minna's flower shop across the street, its cheerful window display a stark contrast to the corporate towers surrounding it. "I need to review the property documents," he told himself, though his feet carried him toward her shop instead. The bell chimed softly as he entered, and Minna looked up from arranging a bouquet of white lilies. Rain had started to fall outside, drumming against the glass storefront. The back room might be better for discussing legal matters, Minna said, her voice professional but distant. She led him past displays of fresh flowers, their sweet scent mixing with the earthy smell of rain. The storage room was small but neat, with shelves of supplies and a small desk tucked into the corner. As Minna reached for a folder of property papers, her elbow knocked against a cardboard box on the highest shelf. Ji-hun moved quickly, catching it before it fell, but the contents spilled across the desk anyway. His breath caught as familiar faces smiled up at him from scattered photographs. "I'm sorry, Minna started, but stopped when she saw what he was looking at. There they were, 16 years old, standing under the cherry trees behind her parents' original shop. In the photo, Ji-hun held up a small silver necklace, half of a heart pendant dangling from its chain. Minna wore its match. "You kept everything," Ji-hun said softly, picking up a pressed cherry blossom, its delicate petals preserved between sheets of wax paper. Beneath it lay a stack of notes passed during high school classes, his messy handwriting filling the lined paper with dreams they'd shared. His phone buzzed, the development company's CEO's name flashing on the screen. Ji-hun let it ring as he lifted a small journal from the box, its pages filled with Minna's careful documentation of their relationship. Photos, movie tickets, dried flowers, every memory preserved with loving attention. "The deadline for property acquisition is tomorrow," Minna said quietly, watching him turn the pages. "I suppose that's why you're really here." Before Ji-hun could respond, his phone rang again. This time he answered it, turning slightly away from Minna. "Yes, Mr. Chairman." "No, I haven't secured the final property yet. I understand the urgency, but—" He felt Minna's eyes on him as he spoke, and his voice faltered. In the journal still open on the desk, a younger version of himself had written, "I promise I'll always protect your dreams, Minna, no matter what." The rain grew heavier outside, trapping them in this small room with their shared past laid bare between them. Every artifact seemed to whisper of the promise he'd made beneath those cherry trees, a promise that now stood in direct opposition to the path he'd chosen. Ji-hun ended the call abruptly, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. The chairman's words echoed in his mind. "Get it done, or we'll find someone who will." The rain drummed harder against the window, creating a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. He looked up to find Minna organizing the scattered photographs, her movements careful and deliberate. "There are irregularities in the development plans," he said suddenly, surprising himself. Minna's hands stilled over the photos. "The company, they're not just building offices. The environmental impact reports don't match their public proposals." Minna turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. "Is that why you've been sitting in the cafe across the street every morning?" she asked, watching the shop. He hadn't realized she'd noticed. Every morning for the past week, he'd ordered the same Americano, chosen the same corner table, and pretended to review case files while watching her arrange flowers in the window. The cherry trees they'd planted as teenagers now framed her shop, their branches heavy with buds nearly ready to bloom. "The community meeting yesterday," Ji-hun continued, stepping closer to the desk. "You spoke about the tree's root systems extending under the proposed development site." He pulled out his tablet, showing her the geological surveys he'd been reviewing. "You were right. The foundation they're planning would kill not just your trees, but the entire grove." Minna leaned over to look at the screen, her shoulder brushing against his. The familiar scent of her shampoo, cherry blossoms, always cherry blossoms, made his chest tighten. "These calculations," she said, pointing to a section of the report. "They knew this months ago?" "Yes." Ji-hun set the tablet down, picking up the journal instead. He turned to a page where his teenage self had drawn a clumsy sketch of their future. A small shop with cherry trees out front, their names carved into the trunk. Someone sent an anonymous tip to the firm yesterday. About us. About the promise. Minna's breath caught. "The Cherry Blossom Festival starts next week," she said softly. "The trees we planted, They'll bloom fully for the first time. A memory flashed through Ji-hoon's mind, standing under falling petals, holding out the heart-shaped necklace. He'd started to make a promise that day, but now the words felt just out of reach, like trying to catch cherry blossoms in the wind. The development company's deadline loomed tomorrow, but as Ji-hoon watched Mina trace her fingers over their old photographs, he realized he'd already made his choice 15 years ago. He just hadn't been brave enough to keep it. The company's property acquisitions, he said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. I've found evidence of illegal practices. If we can prove it before the deadline. Mina's voice was barely a whisper. Ji-hoon reached into the box of memories and pulled out the pressed cherry blossom. Some promises are worth keeping, even if they're 15 years late. Mina's fingers trembled as she held the pressed cherry blossom, its delicate petals still holding their shape after 15 years. Outside, thunder rolled across Seoul's skyline, and the rain beat against the shop's windows with renewed force. Ji-hoon stepped closer, his suit jacket draped over a nearby chair. The corporate armor he usually wore now set aside. The development company falsified more than just the environmental reports, he said, spreading additional documents across the desk. They've been pressuring other shop owners with illegal tactics, threatening their families, cutting off utilities, even staging accidents. His voice grew tight with anger. And my firm knew about it. Mina sank into her chair, the weight of this revelation pressing down on her shoulders. Is that why Mrs. Kim's pipe burst last week? And Mr. Park's delivery truck was vandalized? Ji-hoon nodded grimly. I found internal memos. They're targeting the oldest businesses first, trying to break the community's spirit. He paused, running a hand through his hair. My father. He was involved in similar developments 15 years ago. That's why he pushed me so hard to join this firm. The shop's bell chimed as wind rattled the door. Mina stood, walking to the window where the cherry trees swayed in the storm. Their branches, heavy with unopened buds, scraped against the glass like fingers trying to get in. My father knew, she said softly. The night before he died, he showed me the original buyout offer from back then. He turned it down because he knew your father would use it to force you into law school. Ji-hoon's reflection appeared beside hers in the window. The senior partner gave me until tomorrow morning to file the eviction notices. All of them, including yours. His hand moved as if to touch her shoulder but stopped halfway. They're planning to start cutting down the trees this weekend before the festival. Mina turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The one where we made our promise. It's marked first on their removal list, isn't it? Instead of answering, Ji-hoon pulled out his phone and played a recording. His senior partner's voice filled the quiet shop. Your father understood what had to be done, Ji-hoon. Some promises need to be broken for progress. Make sure his sacrifice wasn't wasted. The thunder crashed again, and Mina jumped. Ji-hoon steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm. The first time he'd touched her since returning. I found something else, he said, pulling a worn envelope from his briefcase. The original plans for this neighborhood, from before my father's firm took over. It shows how the development could have preserved everything. The shops, the trees, the community. Mina opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were blueprints yellowed with age, showing a harmonious blend of old and new. This is what we promised to protect, she whispered. Not just our future, but everyone's. The rain suddenly ceased, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the cherry branches. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed with another message from the firm, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he picked up the pressed cherry blossom and held it under the soft shop lights. I'm going to the ethics board tomorrow morning, he said, with everything I've found. But I need your help to save these trees first. Mina studied the old blueprints spread across her wooden counter, tracing the careful lines with her fingertip. The shop lights cast a warm glow over the yellowed paper, highlighting what could have been. A neighborhood where old and new coexisted in harmony. She looked up at Ji-hoon, seeing the same realization in his eyes. These plans, she said, they prove your father had another choice. He chose to destroy rather than preserve. Ji-hoon loosened his tie, a gesture that seemed to shed more than just physical discomfort. I found more in the archives. Letters between my father and the development company, dating back to when I was in high school. He pulled out another folder. This one marked with red stamps reading, Confidential. They threatened to expose his gambling debts if he didn't cooperate. That's why he pushed me so hard toward corporate law. He was paying off his mistakes with my future. Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the cherry trees, each splash echoing like tiny footsteps from their past. The scent of wet earth and spring flowers drifted through the shop's slightly open door, mixing with the sweet perfume of Minna's fresh bouquets. "The community meeting is tomorrow night," Minna said, gathering her courage. "Before you go to the ethics board, we should show these plans to everyone. Mrs. Kim, Mr. Park, all the shop owners. They need to know they're not alone in this fight." Ji-hun's phone buzzed again, this time with an email from his senior partner. He read it aloud. "Final warning. File the eviction notices by 9 a.m. or clear out your office." Minna reached across the counter and placed her hand over his phone, her touch gentle but firm. 15 years ago, we promised to protect this place, not just for us, but for everyone who calls it home. Maybe that's why you were assigned this case, to finally make things right. Ji-hun pulled out his laptop, opening it to reveal dozens of archived emails and documents. "I've been gathering evidence for weeks. The development company's illegal practices, the environmental violations, the connection to my father's old firm. It's all here. But exposing this means more than just losing my job. The senior partners, they'll try to destroy my reputation, maybe even press charges. Then we'll face it together," Minna said, moving to stand beside him. She pulled out a small box from beneath the counter, filled with photographs and letters from community members spanning decades. "These are our memories, our history. Every story here is proof of what we're fighting for." The shop's bell chimed as the evening wind pushed the door fully open. Cherry blossoms swirled in, dancing around them like pink snow, settling on the blueprints and documents scattered across the counter. Ji-hun picked up one of the petals, so similar to the pressed one from their childhood promise. "The ethics board meets at 10 a.m., he said, determination replacing the doubt in his voice. "But first, we need to call an emergency community meeting, tonight. There's no time to waste if we want to save these trees." Minna quickly gathered the scattered cherry blossom petals into her palm, while Ji-hun pulled out his phone to send urgent messages to the community members. The shop's ancient brass bell chimed repeatedly as elderly Mrs. Kim from the noodle restaurant burst through the door, still wearing her flour-dusted apron. "I saw the lights on," she said, catching her breath. "The construction crews. They're setting up barriers around the cherry tree grove right now." Ji-hun's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, pulling up more documents. "They're moving ahead of schedule. These permits aren't even properly filed yet." He loosened his tie completely now, draping it over a nearby chair. "The development company knows we're close to exposing them." Minna's phone lit up with messages from other shop owners. Mr. Park from the bookstore, the Young sisters who ran the tea house. Everyone was reporting the same thing. Yellow construction tape and metal barriers appearing like wounds across their neighborhood. "We can't wait until tomorrow," Minna said, already pulling out chairs and clearing space in the middle of her shop. The sweet scent of lilies and fresh roses filled the air as she moved arrangements aside. "Call everyone now. We'll have the meeting here." Within 30 minutes, the flower shop transformed into an impromptu war room. Shop owners and residents crowded between the displays, their worried voices mixing with the rustle of papers and the soft patter of rain outside. Ji-hun stood at the counter, his corporate polish giving way to the passionate boy Minna once knew as he spread out the evidence. "These environmental reports were falsified," he explained, pointing to highlighted sections. "The same pattern my father used 15 years ago. They claim the soil is contaminated to justify complete demolition, but independent tests show otherwise." He pulled up another document on his laptop. "And here's proof they've been pressuring small businesses through illegal means. Not just here, but in 3 other historic districts." Minna watched him work, seeing the weight of truth settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about their childhood promise anymore. It was about breaking a cycle of corruption that had destroyed countless communities before theirs. Mrs. Kim stepped forward, her weathered hands trembling as she placed an old photograph on the counter. It showed a younger version of herself standing proud in front of her newly opened restaurant. My grandmother's recipes were born in that kitchen, she said softly. Some things can't be measured in property values. The shop's door opened again, letting in a gust of wind that carried more cherry blossoms. Ji-hun's phone rang, his senior partner's name flashing on the screen. He silenced it without a second glance, then reached for Minna's hand under the counter, their fingers intertwining like roots seeking strength in shared soil. We have until morning to file our complaint with the ethics board, he announced to the room. But first we need statements from everyone. Every memory, every document, every piece of evidence that shows what this neighborhood really means. This isn't just about stopping one development project. It's about exposing a system that profits from destroying communities. Mr. Lee from the barber shop stood up, his voice wavering but determined. My father cut hair in this shop for 40 years. Every first haircut, every wedding preparation, our walls hold these memories. He pulled out a stack of faded photographs, showing 3 generations of neighborhood children getting their first haircuts in his chair. The evidence mounted as each resident shared their story. Ji-hun moved methodically, documenting everything with his phone, his lawyer's precision now serving a deeper purpose. Minna noticed how his hands shook slightly when he handled the old photographs, especially ones that showed the cherry trees in full bloom. Ji-hun, Minna whispered, touching his arm. The sealed envelope. We should show them. He nodded, reaching into his briefcase to retrieve the weathered envelope they'd opened earlier. The childhood photos spilled onto the counter, young Ji-hun and Minna smiling beneath pink petals, their handwritten promise clear and bold across the bottom. We will protect our home together. Mrs. Jung from the tea house gasped softly. I remember taking that photo. You two were always running around, planning how to save the neighborhood even back then. She smiled sadly. Who knew you'd actually be doing it 15 years later? Thunder rumbled outside as Ji-hun's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his father. Minna watched his face darken as he read it. My father... Ji-hun's voice cracked slightly. He knew about the soil report manipulation because he invented the technique. There are documents in his private safe, proof of every neighborhood he helped destroy, including ours 15 years ago. He looked up, meeting Minna's eyes. That's why he sent me abroad. He knew I'd try to stop him. The room fell silent, except for the rain against the windows and the soft rustle of cherry blossom petals settling on the windowsill outside. Minna reached for the map they'd found in the envelope, their childhood marking of every special place in the neighborhood now overlaid perfectly with the development company's demolition plans. Your father's evidence could expose everything, Minna said softly. But using it means destroying my family's reputation. The firm would disown me. Everything I've worked for. Ji-hun straightened his shoulders, looking around at the familiar faces that had watched him grow up. But some prices are worth paying. Mr. Park raised his teacup, hands steady despite his age. You were always a good boy, Ji-hun. Your father's choices aren't yours to carry. As if in response, the shop's lights flickered, and through the windows, they could see construction vehicles rolling down the street, their yellow warning lights cutting through the rain like approaching storm clouds. Through the rain-streaked windows, the construction vehicles' lights cast ominous shadows across the shop walls. Ji-hun's phone buzzed again, this time with a series of rapid-fire messages from the development company's board members. Each one carried thinly veiled threats about his career, his reputation, his future. Minna watched him scroll through the messages, her fingers absently touching the dried petals she kept pressed in her wallet. Petals from the very trees his father had tried to destroy 15 years ago. They're scared, she said softly. They know you have something. Ji-hun loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, spreading the old documents across Mrs. Jung's tea shop counter. His father's familiar signature marked each page like a wound. Look at this. He pointed to a highlighted section. Every displacement project followed the same pattern. First, they cut off utilities claiming maintenance issues. Then mysterious accidents start happening. Broken windows, water damage. Finally, they plant stories about safety violations. Mr. Lee leaned forward, squinting through his reading glasses. Just like the health inspection they sprung on us last week. And the power outages. My father. Ji-hun's voice caught. He cleared his throat and continued. He kept detailed records, not out of guilt, out of pride. Each successful displacement was like a trophy to him. He pulled out another document, this one featuring a younger version of his father, standing in front of cherry trees marked for removal. He even photographed himself at each site. Rain drummed harder against the windows as Mina reached for Ji-hoon's trembling hands. The cherry trees in that photo. They're the same ones we made our promise under. The elderly shop owners gathered closer, passing around the damning evidence. Mrs. Park from the rice cake shop dabbed at her eyes with her apron. I remember when your father first came to the neighborhood, Ji-hoon. He was so different then. Young, idealistic. He used to say he wanted to build communities, not destroy them. Thunder cracked overhead as Ji-hoon discovered a final folder, labeled simply, Son's Future. Inside, he found detailed plans for his overseas education, correspondence with foreign law firms, and most devastating, surveillance photos of him and Mina as teenagers, with dates and times meticulously noted. He tracked every moment, Ji-hoon whispered, his lawyer's composure cracking. He calculated exactly when to send me away, right when the cherry trees would bloom, when he knew I'd be most likely to keep your promise, Mina finished, her voice thick with emotion. She pointed to a particular photo, showing their younger selves painting protest signs. Look at the date. It was the day before you left. Outside, the construction vehicle's engines growled louder, and someone began pounding on the shop's door. The development company's deadline loomed like storm clouds, but inside the small tea shop, surrounded by evidence of his father's betrayal, Ji-hoon made his choice. He reached for his phone, not to answer the mounting messages from the board, but to dial a number he'd memorized years ago, that of Seoul's most relentless investigative reporter. The investigative reporter answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for this call. Ji-hoon's voice was steady despite the chaos surrounding him. Ms. Yoon, I have evidence of systematic corruption spanning 2 decades. How quickly can you meet? The pounding on the shop door grew more insistent. Through the frosted glass, they could make out the silhouettes of suits, probably his father's lawyers. Mina touched Ji-hoon's arm, her fingers brushing against the rolled sleeve of his expensive shirt. We should use the back door, she whispered. Through the storage room. As they gathered the documents, Mrs. Jung shuffled forward with a weathered wooden box. There's more, she said, her hands trembling as she opened it. I've kept records too. Every time they tried to force us out, every accident that happened. Photos, insurance claims, letters from other neighborhoods that suffered the same fate. Ji-hoon's eyes widened as he examined the contents. His father's signature development pattern wasn't just about displacing businesses. It was about erasing entire communities. Each folder told the same story. Thriving neighborhoods transformed into soulless luxury developments. The rain outside intensified, and thunder rolled across the sky as Mina discovered something at the bottom of Mrs. Jung's box. A faded photograph of 2 teenagers planting a cherry tree sapling. Ji-hoon, look, she said softly. This was us, the day we made our promise. He took the photo, remembering that spring afternoon with painful clarity. They'd planted the sapling as an act of defiance after his father had ordered the removal of the older trees. We said we'd protect this place, he murmured, that we'd never let greed destroy what matters most. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of keys jingling. They're trying to force their way in, Mr. Lee warned, peering through the curtains. They've brought the building inspector with them. Ji-hoon quickly photographed each document with his phone, sending them directly to Ms. Yoon. His father's carefully documented trail of destruction was about to become public knowledge. But as he worked, another file caught his attention. Recent blueprints for the neighborhood's renovation. The plan showed something far worse than luxury retail space. His father intended to build a private members-only club, complete with underground parking that would destroy the water table feeding the cherry trees. The trees, Mina gasped, reading over his shoulder. They're not just cutting them down. They're going to poison the entire grove. The lock turned with a decisive click. Ji-hoon grabbed Mina's hand, tucking the most damning evidence into his briefcase. As they hurried toward the back exit, the cherry blossoms outside began to fall, carried by the storm winds. Through the window, they could see the same trees they'd promised under 15 years ago, their petals scattering like memories across the rain-soaked pavement. Behind them, voices filled the shop. Ahead lay uncertainty, but for the first time in 15 years they were facing it together. The weight of their childhood promise had never felt more urgent, or more possible to keep. The back door creaked open into the rain-soaked alley as Ji-hoon and Minna emerged into the stormy night. Behind them, voices echoed through the shop as his father's men searched the premises. Ji-hoon pulled Minna close, shielding the documents with his jacket as they hurried through puddles reflecting neon signs from above. "My office," Ji-hoon said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to organize this evidence before the board meeting tomorrow." His phone buzzed. Another message from Ms. Yoon confirming she'd received the first batch of photos. They made their way through side streets, past the marked cherry trees that swayed in the wind. Each red X spray-painted on their trunks felt like a personal betrayal. Minna stopped suddenly, picking up a fallen blossom. "Ji-hoon, look at the date on these removal notices. It's exactly 15 years from the day you disappeared." Ji-hoon took the paper with trembling hands. The realization hit him like physical pain. His father hadn't just separated them, he'd orchestrated every detail. He knew about our promise, the tree planting, everything. His voice cracked. He waited 15 years to finish what he started. In his office, they spread the documents across his desk. Security footage showed his father's men threatening Minna's parents shortly after Ji-hoon's departure. There were permits filed under shell companies, each one leading back to his father's signature. But it was the personal notes that struck deepest. His father's handwritten plans to cure Ji-hoon of his sentimental weaknesses. "I need to confront him," Ji-hoon said, straightening his tie. "Now, before the board meeting." Minna touched his arm. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." She pulled out the childhood letter she'd found, his younger self's words promising to protect their neighborhood no matter what. "We made that promise together." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt endless. Through the glass walls, they could see construction equipment moving into position around the neighborhood, yellow lights flashing in the rain. The cherry blossoms continued to fall, creating a pale carpet across the darkened streets. When they entered the boardroom, his father was waiting, silhouetted against the storm-dark windows. "I wondered when you'd finally understand," he said without turning. "Everything I did was to make you stronger. Sentiment makes men weak. Love makes them foolish." Ji-hoon placed the evidence on the table, each document a weight lifting from his shoulders. "No, father. What you did was destroy communities to prove you could. You didn't make me stronger. You just made me afraid to feel." Lightning flashed, illuminating the 3 generations of photos Mrs. Jung had preserved, each showing couples making promises under the same cherry trees his father now planned to destroy. The past and present collided in that moment, as Ji-hoon finally understood what real strength meant. His father's words hung in the air as another flash of lightning illuminated the boardroom. Through the wall of windows, Ji-hoon could see cherry blossoms swirling in the storm wind, each petal a reminder of the promise he'd made 15 years ago. The construction equipment's warning lights blinked menacingly in the distance, casting an orange glow across the rain-slicked streets. "You think you've won something here?" His father sneered, finally turning to face them. He picked up one of the photographs, the one showing young Ji-hoon and Min-ah planting their cherry tree. "This evidence will destroy everything our family built. Is that what you want? To throw away generations of success for some flower shop?" Min-ah stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It was never just about the flower shop, Mr. Park. It's about all the families you've hurt, all the communities you've torn apart." The room fell silent, except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Ji-hoon watched as his father's face hardened, transforming into the cold mask he remembered from childhood. Outside, the media vans were arriving, their lights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. "The board meeting starts in 1 hour, his father said, checking his watch. "Make your choice, Ji-hoon. Be the son I raised you to be, or throw it all away for this." "Sentiment." He spat the last word like poison. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed, a message from Ms. Yoon. The press was ready. The community protesters were gathering outside the flower shop, their umbrellas forming a protective canopy over the entrance. Among them stood Mrs. Young, holding her album of neighborhood memories close to her chest. The weight of the briefcase in Ji-hoon's hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Inside were documents that could save the neighborhood, but would tear his family apart. He walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. From this height, he could see the exact spot where he and Minna had made their promise, now marked for destruction. "You're wrong, father," Ji-hoon said, turning back to face him. "Real strength isn't about destroying things. It's about protecting what matters." He opened the briefcase, laying out the evidence one piece at a time. "I am the son you raised, someone who understands the power of contracts and promises. And 15 years ago, I made a promise that's worth more than any corporate legacy." The demolition crews were moving into position now, their machines like dark monsters in the rain. Minna's hand found Ji-hoon's, warm and steady. Together, they watched as the first rays of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, illuminating the cherry blossoms in a soft pink glow. "The board will be here soon," Ji-hoon said, straightening his shoulders. "And they're going to hear the truth about everything, starting with the day you decided to teach your son that love was weakness." The boardroom fell silent as Ji-hoon walked to the podium, his footsteps echoing against marble floors. Through the wall of windows, cherry blossoms danced on the morning breeze, casting delicate shadows across the development plans spread before the committee. He placed 2 briefcases on the polished wood surface, one containing 15 years of his father's secrets, the other holding the community's future. "I made a promise once," Ji-hoon began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Under those same cherry trees that you plan to destroy tomorrow." He opened the first briefcase, revealing decades of documented corruption. "But today, I'm keeping that promise." Minna watched from her seat as Ji-hoon methodically exposed years of corporate manipulation, each piece of evidence striking his father like physical blows. The older man's face grew ashen as his son revealed the truth about forced displacements, falsified environmental reports, and the systematic destruction of family businesses, including the original plot where Minna's shop now stood. When Ji-hoon opened the second briefcase, he pulled out an alternative development plan. "We don't have to destroy history to build the future," he said, revealing detailed proposals for preserving the neighborhood while allowing for sustainable growth. From her seat, Minna recognized the pressed cherry blossom petal tucked into the corner of the blueprint, the same one from their childhood promise. The committee voted unanimously to halt the development. As investigators led Ji-hoon's father away, cherry blossoms continued to fall, coating the sidewalks in pink snow. Outside the building, Minna found Ji-hoon standing beneath their old cherry tree. "You kept our promise," she whispered, taking his hand. "I'm making a new one," he replied, kneeling before her. "Let's protect this place together, properly this time." 1 year later, their wedding ceremony took place beneath those same cherry trees. The neighborhood had been designated a historical district, with blooming memories at its heart. Ji-hoon's new community law practice occupied the building next door, its windows looking out on the trees where 2 children once made a promise that would shape their future. As they exchanged vows, surrounded by the community they'd fought to preserve, petals fell like blessings around them. "Mrs. Young wiped tears from her eyes as she held up her album of neighborhood memories, now with a new photo to add. Proof that some promises, like cherry blossoms, can bloom twice in the same place, even more beautiful than before. In the end, it wasn't just their love story that found its happy ending. It was the story of a community that refused to be erased, of promises kept against impossible odds, and of 2 hearts that found their way back to where they first began, under a canopy of cherry blossoms, where past and future bloomed together in perfect harmony.